The ballroom shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers, every polished surface reflecting gold light across rows of elegantly dressed guests. Waiters moved silently between conversations carrying silver trays filled with champagne, while a string quartet played softly from the corner of the room. The annual Hayes Technologies Leadership Gala had always been Daniel Hayes's favorite night of the year. It was the one evening when every executive, investor, department head, and business partner gathered to celebrate another year of impressive growth. And Daniel never missed an opportunity to remind everyone how much of that success belonged to him. Standing near the edge of the ballroom, Olivia Bennet quietly held a glass of sparkling water she had not touched. She wore a simple navy blue dress without expensive jewelry or designer labels. Nothing about her appearance invited attention, and that was exactly how she preferred it. For 7 years, she had attended these events beside her husband, smiling politely whenever someone asked what she did for a living. "I just run a small business from home," she always answered. The conversation would immediately return to Daniel. Tonight felt different, though she could not explain why. Daniel had barely spoken to her since they arrived. Instead, he spent the evening surrounded by executives laughing louder than usual, accepting congratulations that seemed strangely rehearsed. Across the room, Daniel caught someone's eye and smiled. It was not her. It was Vanessa Brooks. Olivia recognized the younger woman immediately. Vanessa had joined the company only 3 years earlier and had climbed the corporate ladder with astonishing speed. She was polished, confident, and always seemed to appear wherever Daniel happened to be. Olivia had dismissed the uneasy feeling more than once, convincing herself that successful people naturally worked closely together. She wanted to believe that. She had wanted to believe many things. A microphone squealed gently as someone tapped it. The conversation slowly faded. Daniel accepted the microphone with practiced confidence, straightening his expensive tuxedo as applause filled the ballroom. "Thank you, everyone," he said with an easy smile that had charmed countless clients over the years. "This company has had another incredible year, and none of it would have been possible without all of you." More applause followed. Olivia smiled politely. Daniel continued speaking about profits, expansion plans, new partnerships, and future investments. His voice carried naturally across the room. People admired him because he always sounded certain. He never hesitated. Then something changed. His smile became different. More personal. "I've spent years talking about business on this stage," he said. "Tonight, I'd like to share something about my personal life." Olivia felt dozens of eyes shift toward her. Daniel looked directly at Vanessa before continuing. "For a long time, I've stayed in a marriage that ended long before either of us admitted it." The room became impossibly still. Olivia's fingers tightened around her untouched glass. "I've realized something," Daniel continued. "Life is too short to stay with someone who no longer understands who you are." Vanessa lowered her eyes with carefully practiced embarrassment. Daniel walked toward her. "The only person who truly understands me now." He placed one hand gently around Vanessa's shoulder. "It is her." A gasp escaped somewhere near the back of the ballroom. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Daniel looked back toward Olivia, as though he were delivering ordinary business news. "Olivia," he said loudly enough for every person in the room to hear, "we both know this marriage has been over for a long time." She said nothing. "I think everyone deserves honesty." The silence deepened. Daniel reached toward his left hand. Slowly, deliberately, he removed his wedding ring. For one brief second he looked at it. Then he flicked it across the polished floor. The gold band bounced once, twice, before stopping against Olivia's shoes. A few people instinctively stepped backward. Daniel smiled. "Pick it up," he said. Nobody breathed. "It's probably the most expensive thing you'll ever own again." Several executives looked down at the floor. Others stared openly at Olivia, waiting. Waiting for tears. Waiting for anger. waiting for screaming, waiting for the unforgettable scandal they would discuss in offices for years. Olivia looked at the ring resting quietly against her shoe. Then she lifted her eyes toward Daniel. There had once been kindness in his face. There had once been warmth. She searched for even a trace of the man she had met 7 years earlier in a neighborhood coffee shop. The man who had spilled his coffee trying to help her pick up dropped papers and apologized so many times that she had laughed until tears came. That man was gone. Or perhaps he had never existed at all. She bent down. Several people leaned forward. Daniel smiled wider. Instead of picking up the ring, Olivia simply nudged it gently aside with the toe of her shoe so she could walk past it. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was almost impossibly calm. "I hope," she said softly, "that one day you understand what you've chosen tonight." Daniel laughed. "I already have." She nodded once. "I believe you." Without another word, Olivia placed her untouched glass onto a nearby table. She turned. She walked across the ballroom with slow, steady steps. Nobody stopped her. Nobody called after her. The enormous doors closed quietly behind her. Only after the elevator doors slid shut did she allow herself to breathe. The reflection staring back from the mirrored walls looked strangely peaceful. Not because her heart wasn't breaking. It was. Every promise, every anniversary, every ordinary evening they had spent together. All of it seemed to collapse at once inside her chest. A single tear escaped before she gently wiped it away. "No," she whispered to herself. "Not like this." The elevator reached the underground parking garage. She climbed into her modest sedan instead of the luxury vehicle Daniel insisted on driving to public events. The familiar interior wrapped around her like silence itself. For several long moments, she simply sat with both hands resting on the steering wheel. Then she reached into her handbag. She selected one contact. Margaret Lawson. The phone rang only once. "Olivia." Margaret's voice was calm, steady, and immediately concerned. "You never call this late after company events. What happened?" Olivia closed her eyes. "Daniel ended our marriage tonight." Silence. Then Margaret spoke with unusual softness. "I'm coming to you." "No. Olivia." "I'm all right." "You don't sound all right." "I'm not," Olivia admitted quietly, "but I will be." Margaret waited. She had known Olivia for nearly 15 years. She knew when silence mattered more than questions. Finally, Olivia opened her eyes and looked through the windshield toward the glittering lights of the city. Her heartbreak had not disappeared. But somewhere beneath it, something colder had awakened. Something remarkably clear. "Margaret." "Yes." "You've been watching Hayes Technologies for years." "I have." "If someone wanted to acquire it." Margaret hesitated. "It could be done." Olivia looked back toward the ballroom towering above the parking garage. Somewhere inside, Daniel Hayes was undoubtedly celebrating what he believed was the greatest decision of his life. She spoke one final sentence, so calmly that Margaret almost didn't believe she'd heard it correctly. "Can we buy Daniel's company?" The morning after the gala, the city woke to ordinary routines, but Olivia Bennett's world had quietly shifted onto an entirely different path. She stood inside the spare bedroom of the home she had shared with Daniel for 7 years. The room looked unimpressive to anyone else. A small desk, a laptop, shelves lined with notebooks, and an old folding table whose scratched metal legs had been repaired more than once. Daniel had often joked that she should finally throw the table away. He never understood why she smiled every time he said it. That battered table had witnessed the birth of an empire before it had ever witnessed a marriage. Olivia rested her fingertips across its worn surface, and memories flooded back with astonishing clarity. Long before she became someone's wife, she had been a frightened 23-year-old woman living in a tiny apartment above a laundromat, surviving on instant noodles while teaching herself software engineering at night after working double shifts during the day. Her mother, Evelyn Bennett, a hospital nurse who returned home exhausted every evening, had repeated the same lesson until it became part of Olivia's soul. Never let kindness cost you your independence. Keep your own name. Keep your own money. Keep something in this world that belongs only to you. Olivia had obeyed every word. What began as a simple healthcare scheduling program built for overworked nurses slowly became a revolutionary platform connecting hospitals, clinics, pharmacies, and home care providers across the country. Investors who once laughed at the young woman with second-hand clothes later fought for meetings she politely declined. Instead of chasing fame, Olivia quietly built Nova Horizon Holdings, placing every successful company beneath one invisible parent organization. When newspapers searched for the mysterious founder behind the rapidly expanding empire, they found only one public face, Margaret Lawson, the experienced executive Olivia trusted more than anyone alive. Margaret became the celebrated CEO, while Olivia disappeared completely behind confidential ownership structures and private trusts. She had never wanted headlines. She wanted certainty. She wanted to know that if someone ever loved her, they loved the woman sitting across the dinner table, not the billionaire hidden behind legal documents. That was why, 7 years earlier, when Daniel Hayes spilled coffee across both their tables inside a neighborhood cafe, Olivia introduced herself as a woman running a modest online consulting business from home. Daniel had laughed at himself until she laughed with him. He had admired her kindness, her patience, and her quiet confidence. Never once had he asked about her finances beyond casual conversation, and Olivia had convinced herself she had finally found the one man who valued character above status. She quietly paid larger mortgage installments through anonymous transfers, rescued Daniel's struggling investments through shell lenders, and even funded his first executive leadership program without allowing him to know the money originated from her own accounts. Every success Daniel celebrated contained an invisible fingerprint, belonging to the wife he slowly began overlooking. Her phone vibrated gently across the folding table. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. Olivia answered immediately. "I've spent the entire night reviewing Hayes Technologies," Margaret said without greeting. "The founders are desperate for capital. Cash reserves are shrinking, expansion failed overseas, and several investors want out before the numbers become public. Olivia, if you truly want the company, this isn't just possible anymore." Margaret paused before delivering the sentence that made Olivia's heartbeat slow instead of race. "It's already within reach." Olivia looked once more at the folding table where her impossible dreams had first taken shape, then toward the wedding photograph still hanging quietly in the hallway outside. She no longer saw the beginning of a marriage. She saw the beginning of a truth Daniel Hayes had never cared enough to discover. Daniel Hayes believed the hardest part of his new life was already behind him. 3 days after the gala, he moved into a luxury penthouse overlooking the city skyline, convinced he had escaped a marriage that had been holding him back. Vanessa decorated the apartment with expensive flowers and talked excitedly about vacations, promotions, and the brighter future waiting for them. Daniel soaked in every word. He enjoyed the admiration in her eyes because it reflected the image he had carefully built, a successful executive destined for even greater things. What he never questioned was how easily everything around him depended on a company that was quietly slipping beyond his control. Every morning he walked into Hayes Technologies with the confidence of a man who believed he was becoming indispensable, unaware that invisible signatures had already begun changing the future beneath his feet. Meanwhile, Olivia never returned to the house except to collect a few personal belongings. She moved into a quiet penthouse owned through one of Nova Horizon Holdings' private real estate companies, a property Daniel had unknowingly driven past dozens of times without realizing it belonged to his wife. There, surrounded by silence instead of memories, she met Margaret Lawson face to face for the first time since the divorce. Margaret placed several confidential folders across the dining table. "The shareholders accepted the preliminary proposal," she said calmly. "They don't know you're behind it. As far as they're concerned, this is simply another strategic acquisition by Nova Horizon Holdings." Olivia slowly opened the first folder. Inside were financial statements, debt schedules, expansion reports, executive compensation records, and confidential board evaluations. Every page painted the picture of a company growing faster on the outside than it was surviving on the inside. Revenue looked impressive, but debt had quietly multiplied. Investor confidence was weakening. The company Daniel proudly described as unstoppable was balancing on a foundation already beginning to crack. "What about Daniel?" Olivia asked quietly. Margaret looked at her for several seconds before answering. "His performance reviews are extraordinary. Every board member believes he's the future of the company." Olivia nodded without emotion, but something inside her refused to accept that answer completely. She had lived beside Daniel for 7 years. She had watched his personality change with every promotion, every bonus, every compliment from powerful people. She remembered the first time he dismissed an employee during dinner, calling the man replaceable. She remembered how he gradually stopped thanking receptionists, ignored junior staff in elevators, and began measuring human value by job titles instead of character. None of those moments had seemed enormous alone. Together, they formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. "Performance isn't character," Olivia whispered. "Sometimes success hides people better than failure." Margaret leaned forward. "Then what exactly are we looking for?" Olivia closed the folder and answered without hesitation. "Everything: promotions, vendor contracts, executive expenses, human resources complaints, whistleblower reports, compensation decisions, every place where power can quietly become corruption." Margaret studied her expression carefully. "You still think this is bigger than your marriage?" Olivia looked out across the city lights where somewhere Daniel was celebrating a future he believed he controlled. "No," she replied softly. "I'm beginning to think my marriage was only the smallest symptom." Margaret slowly smiled, not from happiness but from recognition. She had seen that look before, years earlier, when a young woman with nothing but a folding table had decided to challenge an entire industry. Without another word, she reached for her phone and called the independent forensic investigation team. As the first confidential instructions were given, neither woman noticed the final email arriving in Daniel Hayes's executive inbox, announcing that the company's mysterious new owners had approved a comprehensive operational review beginning Monday morning. Daniel smiled when he read it, convinced destiny was finally preparing to reward him. He had no idea it had already begun judging him. Monday morning arrived with the polished confidence of every other workday Daniel Hayes had ever known. Yet something invisible had changed before the sun rose over the glass towers of Hayes Technologies. Employees noticed unfamiliar security consultants walking through the lobby with visitor badges that granted unrestricted access. New legal representatives quietly occupied conference rooms usually reserved for board meetings. Information technology specialists nobody recognized were connecting encrypted drives to company servers while introducing themselves simply as members of an independent governance review. Daniel dismissed it all with a wave of his hand. Corporate acquisitions always brought consultants, auditors, and expensive lawyers eager to justify their invoices. He joked about it with Vanessa over coffee, telling her that within a few weeks the new owners would realize they couldn't run the company without him. She laughed exactly when he expected her to, feeding the confidence that had become as necessary to him as oxygen. Across the city, Olivia Bennett entered the headquarters of Nova Horizon Holdings for the first time without disguising herself as anyone else. The receptionist, senior executives, department directors, and board members rose to their feet the moment she stepped through the private executive entrance. Some had worked alongside her for more than a decade while protecting the greatest corporate secret in the company, that the quiet woman everyone assumed lived an ordinary life was the true founder whose vision had quietly built an international investment empire. Olivia acknowledged them with a gentle smile before entering the boardroom where Margaret Lawson had prepared the investigation framework. Thick confidential binders covered the polished table. Every division inside Hayes Technologies had been mapped. Procurement, finance, compliance, executive compensation, vendor management, human resources, cybersecurity, and legal affairs would all undergo simultaneous independent review. "No shortcuts," Olivia instructed calmly. "Every executive receives the same process. Every allegation must be supported by documents. Nobody is guilty because I was married to one of them. Evidence decides everything. Several attorneys exchanged approving glances. Margaret nodded proudly. This was precisely why she had trusted Olivia with an empire while she remained hidden from the world. Inside Hayes Technologies, the first signs of discomfort appeared before lunch. An executive vice president complained that several expense approvals required secondary authorization. Procurement managers discovered payments temporarily frozen pending verification. Human Resources received requests for archived personnel files reaching back almost 6 years. The requests were unusually specific, targeting promotion decisions, anonymous complaints, exit interviews, and severance agreements that most people had forgotten existed. Daniel noticed the unusual activity but remained unconcerned. Companies changed procedures after acquisitions all the time. Besides, he believed his record was spotless. Every promotion he had received was documented. Every contract had executive approval. Whatever these auditors were searching for, they would eventually conclude exactly what every board member already believed, that Daniel Hayes was the company's brightest asset. Late that afternoon, Margaret received the investigation's first preliminary briefing. The lead forensic accountant pointed toward a digital timeline projected across the conference room wall. "Nothing criminal yet," he explained carefully, "but we've identified patterns worth examining. Certain consulting contracts consistently receive approval despite limited supporting work. Several executive bonuses appear disconnected from measurable performance. More importantly, we've located multiple employee complaints marked resolved without any documented investigation." Olivia remained silent while studying the dates. Then her eyes stopped on one familiar year. It coincided almost perfectly with Daniel's promotion into executive leadership. "Expand everything from that period onward," she said quietly. "Don't focus on Daniel. Follow every decision connected to these records." The investigators immediately adjusted their search parameters. Hidden relationships began emerging across departments like faint threads, slowly becoming visible beneath bright light. As evening settled over the city, Daniel stood in his corner office watching employees leave for the day, completely unaware that encrypted copies of thousands of company files had already been preserved beyond anyone's ability to alter or erase them. Across town, Olivia closed the final investigation folder before looking toward Margaret. "Do you feel it?" she asked softly. Margaret answered without hesitation. "Yes." Olivia nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This company isn't simply hiding mistakes, it's hiding a story, and tomorrow the documents begin telling it." The following morning began with a silence that felt heavier than noise. Hayes Technologies still looked immaculate from the outside, but beneath its polished reputation, invisible pressure had begun spreading through every department. Employees whispered as unfamiliar investigators quietly requested archived emails, deleted project folders, board approvals, procurement records, and years of executive communications. Nobody accused anyone of wrongdoing. Nobody raised their voice. Every request arrived with calm professionalism, making the atmosphere even more unsettling. Daniel Hayes walked confidently through the executive floor, smiling at managers who suddenly struggled to meet his eyes. He convinced himself that everyone was simply nervous about the ownership transition. Companies always became anxious after acquisitions. This would pass. It had to. Inside a secured conference room on another floor, Olivia Bennett observed the investigation through a live compliance dashboard instead of attending interviews herself. Margaret Lawson had insisted she remain completely separated from the evidence gathering. "If anyone ever claims this investigation was personal," Margaret reminded her, "they must never be able to say you directed a single interview." Olivia agreed without hesitation. Fairness mattered more than speed. Every executive, every manager, and every employee deserved exactly the same process regardless of title, friendship, or history. She refused to become the kind of leader who decided guilt before hearing the facts. By midday, the forensic technology team uncovered something unexpected. A cybersecurity analyst entered the review room carrying a portable encrypted drive with unusual urgency. "We recovered deleted server logs," he explained, projecting them onto the large screen. "Someone erased several internal complaint records nearly 3 years ago. The files themselves were removed, but the system retained traces of the deletion. Every timestamp pointed toward administrator credentials belonging to senior corporate operations. Margaret folded her arms thoughtfully while Olivia remained expressionless. "Can we prove who used the credentials?" she asked. The analyst shook his head carefully. "Not yet, but we can prove exactly when the records disappeared and which systems accessed them before deletion." Olivia studied the dates. They aligned with a period when multiple respected employees had quietly resigned after reporting irregular contract approvals. Those resignations had always seemed unrelated. Suddenly, they looked connected. Elsewhere in the building, Daniel was attending a strategy meeting with Vanessa Brooks when two compliance officers politely interrupted. They requested temporary access to his archived executive email account and company-issued devices as part of the standard governance review. Daniel laughed confidently before handing everything over. "Knock yourselves out," he joked. "You'll find I work harder than everyone else in this company." The officers thanked him professionally and left without another word. Vanessa smiled, but after the door closed, she noticed Daniel staring toward the hallway longer than necessary. For the first time since the acquisition, uncertainty briefly crossed his face before disappearing behind another confident grin. Late that afternoon, another discovery shifted the investigation in an entirely different direction. Financial analysts identified a consulting firm that had received millions of dollars in recurring contracts despite producing almost no measurable work. On paper, everything appeared legitimate. The invoices carried proper approvals. Payments followed normal procedures. Yet every major authorization ultimately passed through executives closely connected to Daniel's leadership circle. Margaret leaned toward the screen as ownership records slowly loaded from public registries. The room fell silent. The consulting firm's majority shareholder shared the same last name as one of the company's senior executives. Another director listed on the documents was connected through marriage to a member of procurement leadership. Layers of hidden relationships began appearing one after another like pieces of a carefully concealed puzzle. Olivia closed the file without showing surprise. "Do not assume corruption," she instructed quietly. "Relationships are facts, not conclusions. Follow the money, follow the approvals, let evidence speak before anyone does." Margaret smiled faintly. Even now, after everything Daniel had done, Olivia refused to replace fairness with vengeance. But as the investigators expanded their review into years of financial decisions, one senior forensic accountant looked toward Margaret with growing concern. "If these patterns continue beyond what we've already found," he said carefully, "this isn't a single executive abusing authority." He paused before delivering the sentence that changed the entire investigation. "This may be an organized system that existed long before Daniel Hayes ever reached the executive floor." The revelation settled over the investigation room like a storm cloud that refused to move. Olivia Bennett remained motionless, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the conference table, while every investigator studied the expanding network displayed across the wall-sized screen. What had begun as a review of one executive's conduct was transforming into something far larger and far older. Procurement approvals linked to consulting firms. Consulting firms linked to family members of senior managers. Promotions tied to departments with inflated budgets. Anonymous complaints quietly disappearing before reaching independent review. None of it proved criminal conduct by itself, but together it painted the outline of a culture that had quietly learned how to protect itself from accountability. Margaret Lawson broke the silence. "Daniel didn't create this machine." Olivia looked at the glowing web of names before answering softly. "No. But someone taught him how it worked." While the investigation widened behind closed doors, Daniel Hayes was fighting an entirely different battle without realizing it. Invitations that normally arrived automatically for executive dinners, investment briefings, and industry leadership panels suddenly stopped appearing. Phone calls from influential partners went unanswered. A board member who usually greeted him warmly walked past him in the hallway with nothing more than a polite nod. The changes were subtle enough to deny but impossible to ignore. Daniel blamed the acquisition. New ownership always made people nervous. Once everyone understood that he remained indispensable, everything would return to normal. He repeated those words so often that even Vanessa began sounding uncertain when she agreed with him. That afternoon, an independent investigator requested Daniel's presence for what was described simply as a standard executive interview. He entered the conference room wearing the same confident smile that had carried him through countless negotiations. Across the table sat two attorneys, a forensic accountant, and a compliance officer. No accusations greeted him. Instead, they thanked him for his cooperation before sliding several documents across the polished table. "Can you explain the business purpose behind these consulting approvals?" one attorney asked calmly. Daniel glanced at the paperwork and immediately recognized contracts he had signed years earlier. "Those vendors supported strategic expansion," he answered smoothly. "Everything was approved through normal executive channels." The accountant nodded politely before placing another document beside the first. "Can you identify the measurable deliverables produced under these agreements?" Daniel hesitated for less than a second, but everyone in the room noticed it. He spoke confidently about advisory services, market analysis, and executive consulting, yet every answer remained broad, unsupported, and increasingly vague. The investigators never challenged him. They simply thanked him and continued asking precise, patient questions that slowly exhausted every prepared explanation. Across town, Olivia met privately with Margaret after receiving the interview summary. "He's answering exactly the way someone answers when they've never expected to be questioned," Margaret observed. Olivia quietly folded the report. "He's still protecting appearances instead of telling the truth." Margaret studied her carefully. "Does that disappoint you?" Olivia looked toward the rain beginning to fall outside the windows. "Not anymore," she admitted. "The man I married always believed confidence could replace honesty. I kept hoping life would teach him the difference before it was too late." As evening approached, another unexpected breakthrough arrived. Cybersecurity specialists restored fragments of previously deleted employee correspondence that had survived inside archived backup servers. Among hundreds of recovered files was an email written nearly 4 years earlier by a young financial analyst requesting an investigation into suspicious consulting payments. The message had never reached compliance. Instead, internal routing records showed it had been redirected, marked resolved without review, and permanently deleted only hours later. Attached to the recovered metadata was the digital approval chain, identifying every administrator who had handled the complaint before it vanished. Margaret slowly lowered the printed report onto the table. "We finally have our first complete chain of evidence," she whispered. Olivia stared at the names in silence before closing the folder with calm determination. "Then tomorrow," she said quietly, "we stop investigating patterns and start questioning people, because someone spent years making the truth disappear. Tomorrow, the truth begins asking questions of its own." The following morning, Hayes Technologies no longer felt like a company under review. It felt like a company holding its breath. Confidential interview schedules appeared in executive calendars before sunrise, each invitation carrying the same quiet instruction: attendance required, legal representation permitted, all discussions recorded. There were no dramatic announcements, no security guards escorting people through hallways, no rumors intentionally spread. The silence itself became the loudest sound in the building. Employees watched senior leaders disappear behind conference room doors for hours before emerging pale, distracted, and unusually quiet. Even those with nothing to hide sensed that something irreversible had begun. Olivia Bennett refused to sit inside the interview rooms. Instead, she worked from a smaller office overlooking the city, reviewing only completed summaries after every session ended. Margaret Lawson entered carrying the first investigative reports of the day, placing them carefully across the desk. "The process is working," she said. "Nobody can accuse us of targeting anyone. Every interview follows the same structure, the same questions, the same evidentiary standards." Olivia nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Then keep going. Justice isn't measured by how quickly we reach conclusions. It's measured by whether every person is heard before those conclusions are reached." The first executive questioned was Richard Collins, Vice President of Procurement, a man whose reputation for loyalty had protected him for nearly 2 decades. He entered confidently, convinced the review would be little more than administrative inconvenience. The investigators began with ordinary procurement procedures before gradually introducing payment records tied to consulting companies that existed largely on paper. Richard calmly insisted every vendor had delivered valuable strategic advice. The forensic accountant responded without emotion, displaying invoices beside project completion reports that showed no measurable work. Richard shifted in his chair but continued defending the contracts. Then came the ownership documents. One consulting company belonged to his brother-in-law. Another listed his wife's cousin as a silent partner. Richard blinked twice before speaking again. Those relationships were disclosed verbally years ago. The lead attorney slid another document across the table. Can you show us where they were disclosed in writing? For the first time in 20 years of executive meetings, Richard had no answer. Elsewhere inside the building, Daniel Hayes noticed something impossible to ignore. Every executive summoned for interviews returned looking shaken, yet nobody stopped by his office afterward. Men and women who once sought his advice avoided eye contact entirely. Vanessa attempted to reassure him, insisting people were frightened by lawyers and auditors, nothing more. Daniel wanted to believe her, but doubt had begun creeping into places confidence used to occupy. When he checked his calendar, he found another interview request waiting for the following morning. This one listed additional forensic specialists in attendance. His stomach tightened for reasons he refused to admit even to himself. By late afternoon, another breakthrough reached Olivia's desk. One former finance manager, confronted with years of documented approval records, abandoned carefully rehearsed explanations and began speaking openly. According to the interview summary, he described an unwritten understanding among senior leadership. Certain vendors received contracts without meaningful review. Certain executives received promotions regardless of measurable performance. Complaints involving influential managers rarely survived long enough to reach formal investigation. Nobody had needed written instructions because everyone understood the system. The reward for cooperation was career advancement. The penalty for questioning it was professional isolation. Olivia read every page twice before quietly setting the folder aside. The corruption had become something even more dangerous than individual misconduct. It had become organizational habit. Margaret watched her closely. "How are you holding up?" she asked softly. Olivia looked toward the framed photograph of her late father resting on the bookshelf behind her desk. "When I asked you to buy this company," she answered, "I thought I was confronting one man's betrayal. Instead, we're uncovering years of betrayal against hundreds of honest employees who never knew why they kept losing opportunities." Margaret remained silent. Olivia's voice stayed calm, but beneath it rested unmistakable sadness. "Daniel hurt me personally," she continued. "This system hurt people who never even knew my name." As evening settled over the city, the lead forensic investigator requested an emergency meeting. He entered carrying a sealed evidence folder marked with unusually high confidentiality. Without speaking, he placed it before Olivia and Margaret. Inside rested recovered internal emails exchanged between several senior executives years before Daniel's promotion. One message contained a single sentence that froze the room. "Make sure Hayes understands how things are done before he takes the position." Olivia slowly closed the folder, her expression unreadable. Daniel Hayes had not invented the corruption consuming the company. Someone had carefully welcomed him into it, trained him to protect it, and now the investigation was moving toward the people who had taught him everything. Daniel Hayes barely slept that night. The confidence that had carried him through every promotion, negotiation, and board presentation had begun cracking beneath a pressure he could neither control nor fully understand. Long after midnight, he sat alone in the penthouse apartment he had once believed represented permanent success, replaying every interview question in his mind. None of the investigators had accused him directly. None had raised their voices. Yet every carefully prepared answer had seemed strangely useless, as though they already knew far more than they were revealing. By sunrise, he had convinced himself of one comforting explanation. Olivia was behind it. She was feeding them information out of revenge. It was the only story that allowed him to avoid considering a far more dangerous possibility that the evidence existed entirely without her. Across the city, Olivia Bennett arrived before dawn at Nova Horizon Holdings, carrying nothing except a leather notebook and a cup of coffee. Margaret Lawson was already waiting inside the executive conference room, where the latest investigation updates covered an entire wall. Overnight, forensic analysts had reconstructed years of executive communications from archived backup systems previously believed unrecoverable. Every recovered message strengthened the same conclusion. Hidden favoritism had become routine long before Daniel entered senior leadership. Promotions had been quietly arranged, procurement contracts steered toward connected families, complaints buried, and internal critics gradually pushed out until remaining employees learned that silence was safer than honesty. Olivia stood before the growing web of names without satisfaction. She had expected wrongdoing. She had never expected an entire culture built around protecting it. Daniel's second executive interview began precisely at 9 o'clock. This time the atmosphere felt different before anyone spoke. The attorneys greeted him politely, but additional investigators now occupied seats around the conference table. Digital displays replaced paper files. Every answer would be compared instantly against years of recovered records. Daniel maintained his practiced smile as questions resumed, explaining consulting approvals, executive recommendations, and restructuring decisions with polished confidence. Then the lead investigator displayed an internal email recovered from an archived server. It contained Daniel's own response, approving an unusually expensive consulting agreement. Beneath his approval appeared a message from another executive reminding him that the vendor belonged to one of our own. Daniel frowned. "I don't remember seeing that sentence." The forensic specialist calmly enlarged the metadata. "The message reached your inbox unopened, but your approval followed 23 minutes later." Daniel's pulse quickened. "I relied on my team's recommendations." The attorney nodded thoughtfully. "So you approved million-dollar contracts without reading the supporting correspondence?" Silence filled the room. Every possible answer carried consequences. While Daniel struggled inside the interview, another executive finally broke. Richard Collins requested a second meeting with investigators, this time accompanied by independent legal counsel. After reviewing the growing body of evidence, he abandoned years of careful loyalty. He admitted that new executives entering senior leadership were quietly instructed which vendors to favor, which managers to protect, and which employee complaints should disappear before reaching formal review. Nobody ever used words like corruption or fraud. Instead, they called it preserving stability, protecting relationships, or maintaining executive unity. Richard described private dinners, informal conversations, and unwritten expectations that shaped every important decision inside the company. By the time his statement ended, investigators possessed something they had lacked from the beginning: first-hand testimony explaining exactly how the hidden system survived for so many years. Margaret delivered the interview summary to Olivia personally. Neither woman spoke while reading the final pages. At last, Margaret closed the folder. "Daniel followed the system," she said quietly. Olivia answered without hesitation. "Yes." Margaret looked at her carefully. "Does that change anything?" Olivia slowly shook her head. "No, being taught something wrong doesn't remove responsibility for choosing to continue it. Plenty of honest people worked here under the same pressure without selling their integrity." She paused before adding softly, "He inherited a broken culture. Then he decided it benefited him." Late that afternoon, employees noticed unfamiliar activity outside the executive offices. Independent governance officers began securing archived records from departments never previously included in the review. Word spread quietly that the investigation was expanding beyond individual misconduct toward possible failures of board oversight itself. Senior directors who had remained comfortably distant from earlier interviews suddenly received urgent calendar invitations, marked mandatory attendance. Panic traveled upward instead of downward for the first time in company history. As evening settled over the city, the lead investigator entered Olivia's office carrying a sealed envelope that required her personal acknowledgement before opening. Inside was a confidential memorandum prepared only minutes earlier. It contained one sentence highlighted across the first page. Recovered board communications indicate at least one current director possessed prior knowledge of the concealed governance practices and actively discouraged independent review. Olivia looked up slowly. The corruption had climbed higher than anyone imagined, and tomorrow the investigation would reach the boardroom itself, where the people who believed they had always remained untouchable were finally about to answer questions of their own. The emergency board meeting was scheduled before sunrise, and by 8 o'clock every director of Hayes Technologies sat around the long walnut conference table beneath the company logo that for years had symbolized prestige, stability, and unquestioned success. This time the atmosphere carried none of those comforts. Independent legal counsel occupied one side of the room. Governance specialists filled the seats along the walls. Every conversation ended the moment Olivia Bennett entered beside Margaret Lawson. For the first time since acquiring the company, Olivia attended a formal board session not as the quiet new owner observing events from a distance, but as the woman responsible for deciding what came next. She greeted every director politely before taking her seat at the head of the table. Her calm expression unsettled them more than anger ever could. Daniel Hayes arrived several minutes later, expecting another procedural meeting about the investigation. Instead, he immediately sensed something entirely different. Thick evidence binders rested before every director. A large screen displayed only the words Independent Governance Review. Nobody welcomed him. Nobody attempted casual conversation. Vanessa Brooks was nowhere in sight because, unlike executive leadership, she had not been invited to attend. Daniel looked towards several directors who had once supported every proposal he presented. They deliberately avoided his eyes. For the first time in his career, the room that had always strengthened his confidence made him feel completely alone. The lead investigator began speaking without drama. Over the previous 6 weeks, he explained, investigators had examined more than 3 million electronic records, thousands of financial transactions, archived communications, procurement approvals, whistleblower files, and executive correspondence. Every conclusion presented today would be supported by independently verified documentation. No findings depended upon rumor, personal testimony alone, or ownership preference. The process, he reminded everyone, had been intentionally designed so that even the owner herself possessed no authority to alter the evidence. Olivia remained silent while several directors exchanged increasingly anxious glances. Daniel folded his hands together, determined not to reveal uncertainty. The presentation unfolded with devastating precision. Charts demonstrated years of preferential contracting. Financial records connected favored vendors to executives through undisclosed family relationships. Deleted complaint histories reappeared alongside recovered server logs, proving deliberate interference with internal reporting systems. Promotion decisions were compared against performance evaluations, revealing repeated patterns in which qualified employees were bypassed while politically connected candidates advanced. Every slide removed another layer of plausible denial. When the investigators reached the recovered board communications, the room became almost painfully still. Emails showed that warnings had reached senior leadership years earlier, only to be dismissed as unnecessary disruption. One director quietly removed his glasses and lowered his head into his hands. Another stared motionlessly at the evidence, as though seeing his own career disappear page by page. Daniel finally interrupted. "This proves there was a culture problem," he argued, forcing confidence into his voice. "It proves mistakes were made long before I became an executive. You're trying to make me the face of something I inherited." Olivia did not answer. Instead, the investigator calmly advanced to the next slide. It displayed a timeline beginning years before Daniel's promotion and continuing through his leadership. The early years documented inherited governance failures. The later years documented something different: expanded consulting contracts, increased budget manipulation, additional suppressed complaints, newly created executive positions with little measurable purpose. The corruption had not merely continued under Daniel's leadership. It had accelerated. "The evidence indicates," the investigator said evenly, "that existing weaknesses were significantly expanded after Mr. Hayes assumed executive authority." Daniel's face hardened. "That's your interpretation." The investigator gently shook his head. "No, Mr. Hayes, that's the documented sequence." Silence settled over the boardroom until one of the longest-serving directors slowly stood. His voice carried the weight of genuine regret rather than self-preservation. "We failed this company," he admitted quietly. "Some of us ignored warning signs because success made complacency comfortable. Others looked away because confronting influential executives felt inconvenient. We convinced ourselves that strong financial performance justified everything else. We were wrong." One after another, several directors nodded without speaking. The admission did not erase responsibility, but it shattered years of carefully maintained denial. Only then did Olivia rise from her chair. She did not look toward Daniel first. Instead, she faced every person around the table equally. "This investigation was never about finding one villain," she said calmly. "It was about discovering whether truth still had a place inside this company. Today we have that answer. Some inherited broken systems. Some benefited from them. Some protected them. Others stayed silent because they believed speaking would cost them everything. Beginning today, every decision we make will be guided by one standard only: the evidence. Not friendships, not titles, not history, not personal relationships. Accountability belongs wherever the facts place it." Before anyone could respond, the general counsel quietly entered carrying a sealed legal packet marked urgent. He handed it directly to Olivia before addressing the room. "These documents arrived from federal authorities less than 15 minutes ago," he announced. "They are requesting immediate cooperation regarding matters identified during our internal investigation." Every eye turned toward the unopened envelope. Olivia broke the seal slowly, read the first page, and without changing her expression looked toward Daniel. The internal investigation had ended. What began next would no longer be controlled by the company at all. The room remained perfectly still as Olivia Bennett lowered the letter from the authorities onto the polished boardroom table. No one spoke. The silence itself carried more weight than any accusation could have. Daniel Hayes searched her face, expecting triumph, satisfaction, or revenge. Instead, he found only calm. It unsettled him more than anger ever would have. For the first time since their marriage had ended, he realized she was no longer reacting to him at all. She had become someone moving toward a future that no longer required him to exist inside it. The company's general counsel carefully explained that the authorities were requesting cooperation regarding potential financial misconduct, obstruction of internal reporting, and governance failures uncovered during the independent investigation. The company would provide every requested document, every server record, and every interview summary collected through lawful procedures. Olivia quietly signed the authorization without hesitation. "From this point forward," she said evenly, "the legal process belongs to the legal system. Our responsibility is complete transparency." She looked around the boardroom. No one receives special treatment. No one is sacrificed to protect someone else. The evidence will speak for itself. Daniel slowly rose from his chair, his confidence finally collapsing beneath the weight of reality. "You're really going to let this happen?" he asked, his voice barely steady. After 7 years together, Olivia met his eyes with genuine sadness. 7 years mattered to me every single day we lived them, but those years don't erase what happened inside this company. I offered you opportunities to be honest. The investigation offered you opportunities to be honest. Every choice after that belonged to you." Daniel opened his mouth as though searching for another argument, but every explanation suddenly sounded empty even to himself. The room waited. None came. He quietly removed his executive identification badge and placed it on the table. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. Several people simply lowered their eyes because even accountability carried its own sadness. Daniel walked toward the boardroom door without looking back. Just before leaving, he paused for one final moment. "Did you ever stop loving me?" he asked softly. Olivia answered with complete honesty. "I stopped making myself small for someone who never truly saw me. Once I remembered who I was, there wasn't enough room left for the life we had built on pretending." Daniel nodded once before walking away. The door closed behind him with a quiet click that somehow sounded louder than the applause he had once received from the very same boardroom. Months passed, and the transformation of Hayes Technologies became visible to everyone who entered the building. The invented executive divisions disappeared. Resources returned to engineering, customer support, research, and the employees who actually created value. Independent whistleblower protections became permanent policy. Every complaint received an external case number that could never again be erased by a company administrator. Promotions required measurable performance rather than personal relationships. Employees who had spent years keeping their heads down slowly began raising concerns without fear. Trust did not return overnight, but it returned one honest decision at a time. Olivia personally contacted every former employee whose documented complaints had been ignored. Some accepted invitations to return. Others had built successful careers elsewhere and politely declined. She respected every decision. More important than rebuilding the workforce was restoring something many of them believed they had lost forever, the confidence that they had been telling the truth all along. One conversation after another reminded Olivia that leadership was never measured by how many people followed her. It was measured by how many people felt safe enough to tell the truth around her. Margaret Lawson gradually stepped away from daily operations, smiling as she watched Olivia lead openly for the first time in her life. One afternoon she found Olivia sitting at the same old folding table that had traveled from a tiny apartment to the corner of an executive office overlooking the city. Expensive furniture surrounded it, yet Olivia still completed her most important work there. Margaret smiled. "You could replace that table 100 times over." Olivia gently ran her hand across its worn surface. "I could," she replied, "but it reminds me that I built my first dream here before anyone believed I could. It reminds me never to confuse success with who I am." A year later, Hayes Technologies received a national award recognizing excellence in corporate governance and ethical leadership. During the ceremony, reporters naturally asked about the dramatic acquisition that had changed everything. Olivia stood at the podium beneath bright lights and answered with the same quiet honesty that had guided every decision since the divorce. "People often describe this as a story about money," she said. "It isn't. Money bought a company. Character rebuilt it. What changed my life wasn't becoming wealthy. It was finally refusing to disappear so someone else could feel important." The audience remained silent before rising together in a standing ovation. When the event ended, Olivia stepped outside into the evening air and looked across the city skyline she had quietly helped build for years. She thought about her mother, whose simple advice had carried her through every season of life. Keep your own name. Keep your own purpose. Never surrender the part of yourself that no one else has the right to own. She had done exactly that. Daniel had believed he was divorcing an ordinary wife. He never realized he was walking away from the woman who had built an empire with patience, integrity, and quiet determination. But in the end, that was no longer the lesson that mattered most. The greatest victory was never buying his company. It was reclaiming her own voice, rebuilding a broken culture with fairness instead of revenge, and proving that real power is not found in humiliating those who hurt you. Real power is choosing to build something so honest, so just, and so enduring that your future is never again defined by the person who failed to recognize your worth. And from that day forward, Olivia Bennet never made herself small for anyone again.